Some apartments stay empty for years. Others only pretend to be. Emma Larson did not realize the difference until the lights began turning on across the hall. Emma moved into Elmwood Apartments on a cold October afternoon when the sky hung low over the city and the wind carried the smell of rain through the streets. The building stood quietly between two shuttered storefronts, its brick exterior faded by decades of weather and neglect. The windows were tall and narrow, their frames chipped and dull, and the front door creaked loudly when she pushed it open for the first time. It wasn't the kind of place anyone dreamed of living in, but the rent was cheap and the neighborhood was quiet, which was more than enough for her. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of dust and old varnish. The wooden floors groaned softly beneath her footsteps as she carried the last of her boxes toward the staircase. Somewhere deep in the building, pipes clanged inside the walls like distant metal echoes. It was the kind of noise old buildings made when they settled into the night. Emma didn't mind it. In fact, she liked the quiet. For the past year she had been sharing apartments with strangers, people who slammed doors at midnight, argued in kitchens, and filled the air with constant noise. This place felt different. So private. A place where she could finally sleep. Her apartment was 3B, near the end of the third-floor hallway. When the building manager handed her the keys, Emma noticed another door directly across from hers. 3C. The brass number hung slightly crooked on the wood. She barely thought about it at the time. Mr. Green, the building manager, was a thin man in his early 60s with pale gray hair and tired eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He spoke politely but rarely smiled, and there was something distant about the way he looked at the hallway as he explained the building's rules. "Quiet building," he said, placing the keys in her hand. "Most tenants keep to themselves." Emma nodded. Quiet was exactly what she wanted. For the first 3 days, nothing unusual happened. She unpacked slowly, arranging furniture and stacking books on a narrow shelf beside the couch. At night she sat by the window with her laptop while the city hummed faintly outside. Occasionally the floorboards creaked or the pipes rattled somewhere in the walls, but those sounds felt normal. Predictable. The building felt old but harmless. On the fourth night she noticed the light. Emma was washing a mug in the kitchen sink when a faint glow flickered across the living room wall. At first she assumed it was a car passing outside, but when the light appeared again she realized it was coming from the hallway. Curious, she walked quietly to the front door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. But beneath the door of apartment 3C, a thin strip of yellow light spilled across the floorboards. Emma frowned. She hadn't seen that door open once since moving in. In fact, she had never heard anyone enter or leave the apartment. She assumed someone new had moved in. Still, something about the light felt strange. It flickered once, dimmed, then brightened again. Emma waited a few seconds, expecting the door to open. It never did. Eventually she shrugged and returned to the kitchen, telling herself she was overthinking it. But the next night the same thing happened. At exactly 10:47 p.m., the light beneath 3C's door appeared again. Emma noticed the time only because she had just checked her phone. The light flickered, turned off, then came back on. The following night it happened again. 10:47 p.m. Light. Dark. Light again. 3 nights in a row. That was when the pattern began to bother her. The next morning she mentioned it casually to Mr. Green while checking her mail in the lobby. "Someone moved into 3C?" she asked. The building manager paused while sorting envelopes into the metal mailboxes. The pipe in his hand stopped halfway to his mouth. "No," he said quietly. Emma hesitated. "I've seen the lights on." Mr. Green slowly shook his head. "That apartment has been empty for years." Emma laughed awkwardly. "Well, someone's definitely using the lights." For a moment the manager simply stared at her. Then he said, "Old wiring. Happens sometimes." But the way he avoided looking down the hallway made Emma uneasy. That night she watched the door again. At 10:47 p.m., the light appeared exactly as before. Emma waited longer this time. 5 minutes passed. 10. The hallway remained silent. Finally she opened her door and stepped outside. The overhead lamp buzzed faintly, casting long shadows along the corridor. The wooden floor creaked under her feet as she approached the door of 3C. The light beneath it glowed steadily. Emma raised her hand and knocked. The sound echoed softly down the empty hallway. She waited. Nothing happened. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Soft and slow. Inside the apartment. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Someone was definitely there. But instead of approaching the door, the footsteps moved farther away, disappearing deeper into the apartment. Emma stood frozen for several seconds before returning quietly to her own apartment. The unease began a few nights later. Emma woke suddenly at 2:13 a.m. to the sound of movement in the hallway. Footsteps again. But this time they weren't inside the apartment across the hall. They were outside her door. Slow, deliberate steps moved back and forth along the corridor, the wooden floorboards creaking with each turn. Emma lay perfectly still in bed, listening as the footsteps passed her door, paused, then returned again. Back and forth, back and forth. The pacing continued for several minutes. Finally, Emma forced herself out of bed and crept toward the door. Her heart thumped loudly as she leaned toward the peephole. The hallway was empty. Completely empty. Yet the footsteps continued. And beneath the door of 3C, the yellow light was glowing again. But the footsteps she heard were not coming from inside that apartment. They were pacing directly outside her own door. Emma stepped back slowly, her pulse racing. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence filled the hallway. For a long moment nothing happened. And then, from the other side of the door across the hall, a voice whispered softly, "Emma." Emma stood frozen in the darkness of her apartment, staring at the door while the echo of her name seemed to linger in the hallway. For several seconds she convinced herself she had imagined it. Old buildings carried sounds strangely through walls and floors. Someone on another level might have been speaking. The pipes might have shifted. Her own mind, half awake from sleep, might have filled in the rest. But deep down she knew that wasn't true. No one in the building should have known her name. Emma slowly stepped toward the door again and pressed her eye against the peephole. The hallway light buzzed faintly above, casting a weak yellow glow along the narrow corridor. The floorboards were empty. No movement. No shadows. Just the closed door of apartment 3C, the strip of light still glowing beneath it. She stared for nearly a full minute. Nothing moved. Eventually she returned to bed, though sleep did not come easily. Each time she closed her eyes she felt the strange certainty that someone was standing outside the door, waiting quietly for her to look again. The next morning Emma told herself the experience had been a dream. But the feeling of unease stayed with her all day. That evening she returned from work later than usual, the sky already dark when she reached the third floor. As she walked down the hallway something immediately felt wrong. The door of 3C was slightly open. Only an inch or two. Just enough for a thin line of light to spill into the corridor. Emma slowed her steps. She had never seen that door open before. For a moment she considered knocking again, but something about the silence of the hallway stopped her. Instead, she walked quickly to her own apartment and went inside, locking the door behind her. She tried to ignore the feeling that someone across the hall was watching her through that narrow opening. At 10:47 p.m., the light flickered again. Emma hadn't intended to watch the hallway that night, but when the glow appeared beneath her door, she felt the same uneasy pull of curiosity. She approached quietly and looked through the peephole. The door of 3C was closed again. The hallway was empty. But something else had changed. Scratches covered the wood of the doorframe, faint but unmistakable, as if someone had dragged something sharp across the surface again and again. Emma was certain those marks hadn't been there before. A chill ran down her spine. The following afternoon she decided to search for information about the building. At the public library she spent nearly 2 hours scrolling through old city records and archived newspaper articles. Most of the information she found was ordinary: maintenance permits, ownership changes, minor repairs. Then she found an article from 1997. The headline was small, buried in the corner of a page. Local resident missing from Elmwood Apartments. The article described a tenant who had vanished from apartment 3C. Police had searched the building but found no evidence of forced entry. The man had simply disappeared overnight. Emma read the article twice before continuing her search. 8 years later, another article appeared. Second disappearance linked to same building. Another tenant from apartment 3C had vanished. The report mentioned that neighbors had heard strange noises coming from the apartment in the weeks before the disappearance. Footsteps. Voices. Someone pacing the hallway late at night. Emma's stomach tightened as she kept reading. A third disappearance occurred in 2012. A fourth in 2018. Each report described nearly the same pattern. Strange sounds. Lights turning on in the apartment. Tenants hearing voices. And then, eventually, someone vanishing without explanation. Emma closed the computer screen slowly. Something about apartment 3C was very wrong. That night she confronted Mr. Green in the lobby. The building manager listened quietly while she described what she had discovered. His expression remained unreadable, though his fingers tightened slightly around the pipe he was holding. "You knew," Emma said finally. "People disappeared from that apartment." Mr. Green stared at the floor for a long moment before speaking. Yes, he said softly. Then why do you still rent the apartments near it? Because nothing has happened in several years. Emma felt anger rising in her chest. People vanished, Mr. Green. The old man sighed. They always vanish after the same thing happens, he said. What thing? Mr. Green looked toward the stairwell as if making sure no one else was nearby. They start hearing their names. Emma felt a cold wave pass through her body. They hear it at night, he continued quietly. A voice calling them from the hallway. Sometimes from inside the apartment. Emma swallowed. What is it? Mr. Green shook his head slowly. No one knows. But the people who hear it, they always become curious. He looked at her carefully. And eventually they opened the door. That night Emma sat in her living room staring at the hallway door for hours. At 10:47 p.m., the light appeared again. The same flicker. The same glow beneath the door across the hall. Emma told herself she would ignore it. But just after midnight she heard something that made her stand up from the couch. A voice. Soft. Barely audible. Emma? It came from the hallway. Her heart began pounding. The voice came again, slightly louder this time. Emma? Without realizing it, she had already stepped into the corridor. The hallway light flickered weakly above her as she approached apartment 3C. The door was open. Only a few inches. Emma hesitated at the threshold. Inside, the apartment looked abandoned. Dust coated the furniture and the air smelled stale, as though no one had entered the room for years. But the kitchen light was on. And somewhere deeper inside the apartment she heard movement. Slow footsteps crossing the floor. Emma stepped inside. The air felt strangely heavy, almost warm. She walked slowly through the living room, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The walls were covered with faint scratches, hundreds of thin lines carved into the paint. At first they looked random. Then she realized they formed words. Names. Dozens of them. Some were faded with age. Others looked newer. Emma moved closer to read them. Her breath caught in her throat. The last name on the wall had been carved recently. The letters were sharp and fresh. Emma. She stumbled backward, her pulse racing. The light above the kitchen sink flickered violently. Then the voice spoke again. But this time it wasn't whispering from somewhere in the apartment. It came from right behind her. Emma? She turned slowly. The hallway door stood open across the room. Beyond it she could see the corridor outside. And standing in the hallway was someone who looked exactly like her. The figure watched silently for a moment. Then it stepped backward into the corridor. Emma rushed toward the doorway. But when she reached the hall, no one was there. Only the long, empty corridor of the third floor. And across from her apartment. There was no door. Emma stared at the wall where 3C should have been. The hallway ended at her apartment now. Just a blank stretch of plaster where the door had stood. As if the apartment across the hall had never existed at all. Behind her, something moved inside the room. Emma turned slowly. The door was gone. And the light inside the apartment flickered on again. At 10:47 p.m. As footsteps began pacing quietly outside a door that no longer existed. If you stayed till the end, there are more stories waiting for you. Subscribe to Thrilling Script for more psychological horror and thriller stories.